Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to the Phanteks Eclipse P200A D-RGB. Much like this case, I've set this review to be smaller than usual. I'm also introducing an as objective as possible rating system, which I'll explain in depth in a separate video, but you'll see that in action later on. So keep those eyes and ears open and get ready for a dense review. On the packaging front, we've got a standard cardboard box and well-sized polystyrene molds and a plastic cover. Not much more else to add, so let's move on to the exterior. Up front, we've got a perforated steel panel that acts as the front filter. It's fairly dense for an integrated filter, but won't be as thorough as a standard mesh internal filter. Just below is the front I/O with LED mode and color buttons, a couple of USB 3.0 Type A ports, and a Type C port. On that note, how many people highly value a Type C port? I'm still in the phase of owning only Type A to Type C cables, and this Type C connector is wasted. Am I the odd one out here? Let me know. Moving on, of course, we have a large glass panel covering the entirety of one side of the case, and the other side has an all-steel panel with another integrated filter. Visually, this filter looks like one of those flimsy plastic perforated... I have one over here, actually. Like one of those flimsy plastic perforated sheets with magnetic strips, but it's actually the steel of the panel that's been pressed into this shape and perforated. Come to think of it, the fact that it looks like a plastic magnetic filter strip makes it appear worse than it actually is. Perhaps it's visually selling itself short. Moving on, to the rear we've got a high power supply unit, low graphics card configuration, and up top is a completely sealed off sheet of steel with the power button just to the front, which comes with a halo style light diffuser, also ARGB like the fans. And last but by no means least, the base of the case makes up for the sealed top with a full-size filter. We've also got some foam pads on the feet that I would describe as adequate. Back to that filter and forward to the front panel removal. We actually need to remove the front panel to remove the bottom filter. I'm not even going to try and do it live now. Removing the front panel is a case of pulling on it. It uses a slightly better version of the standard socket and post fixing, which creates a lighter holding force than a lot of front panels around, which is good in general, and especially good since you need to remove it in order to access the filter. Not even going to try and do that now. You can insert the filter from the rear, but it's clearly not intended since it doesn't sit nice and flush against the rear of the case. And then you need to move your system to access the filter rather than removing the front panel, so it's not ideal either way. Not awful, just not ideal. Removing the window panel requires wedging a thumb or finger into the slim gap to the rear of the panel. It's less of a pull as the label indicated, and more of a rock climbing tip of your finger grip. There's a holding mechanism as the panel is being removed, which is a nice addition, but there's nothing to fix the panel in place, like a thumb screw, which is fine since the holding force is plenty strong for its purpose. The other side panel is much the same as the window, only there is a rear screw to fix the panel in place, which I think I found in the accessories box after I opened it up. It wasn't there to begin with, that's for sure, but it's a nice needed addition since cable management can be challenging at times. Lastly on this, panel flex is good thanks to the thickness of the steel and the returns all around the edges. Now it's time to talk fans and radiators. Radiator-wise, this case has got a lot of options. Easy ones first, the rear can take a 120mm and the base can't due to the graphics card position above. Well, maybe it can, but it's not officially supported and you'd really need to buy the case and the parts you intend to use first to measure everything up. Up front you can fit up to a 280 or 240mm radiator to the side or front panel. That's a certain or there, no ands in sight. Just throwing in a couple of 120mm fans to the side in addition to the included front 120mm fans almost causes a clash, so no dual 240mm radiators in this thing. Fan-wise, in the front and side is a reflection of the radiator compatibility. You can do 120s to the front and side, but not 140s to both at the same time. The base can take a couple of 120mm fans depending on your graphics card depth. I'd say if you're using a single slot card it's fine, but dual or triple slots I wouldn't bother. And the rear can take a single 120 as expected. Stock fans that come with the case are D-RGB or ARGB, 4-pin 1600 RPM fans. At least these ones, they're there now. At least these ones ran at 1600 RPM. No idea what they should run at since they're unspec'd fans. Just looking at the rear label, nothing to see. Good fans though, and I'd recommend sticking with them unless you've hyped yourself up on Noctua fans and can't think of anything else until you've got them. Now onto the system building. Starting with the power supply unit, as noted earlier, it's mounted up top, but it has a rear bracket that needs removing first, which is then used to mount the power supply unit to outside of the case, and then you slide the assembly back in, which is guided into position by the top and bottom tabs just sticking out on the inside. Mechanically, this system works really well, but visually, you're gonna see all of those cables inside since there's nothing to mask them. I think the Metallic Gear Neo G Mini might be a preferred option to a lot of people in this regard. Spec-wise, it takes an ATX-sized power supply unit with clearance up to 160mm without compatibility issues, and up to 180mm, which would encroach on side fan or radiator zones. I'm talking total clearance, by the way, with space for the cables to exit and turn to the rear. So think 140 to 160mm deep units maximum. Motherboard-wise, we're talking ITX boards only. Phanteks were nice enough to include 2 standoff posts which help with getting the board in the right place. But with that power supply unit so tight to the board, getting to the screws past the cooler as well is tight. If you think you'll struggle, you might want to consider installing the board without installing the cooler, or installing the board with the cooler but without installing the power supply unit, but with the cables routed so you can connect them to the board and then install the unit above. A bit of a faff, but all perfectly doable. CPU cooler wise, you've got 165mm of clearance to the panel, more than enough for most of the larger coolers on the market. Keep an eye on the depth of the cooler though. I couldn't squeeze a fan past the Mugen 5. Perhaps another thing to consider in the build order. Fans first, then apply the board and power supply unit. On that note, perhaps a cutout here would be a nice addition to allow fans to go past post-build. But that's on a missed opportunity side of things, I guess. Onto drives, and unfortunately there's only space for 2.5-inch drives by default. There are a couple of drive slots on a panel in the rear compartment, over here. There's not a lot to explain here, just remove the panel, add the drives, replace the panel, job done. Taking the total drive count up to 4 2.5-inch drives, are 2 plastic panels in the main compartment. They're held into the side fan and radiator mounting position with some plastic tabs and work much in the same way as the previous bracket. However, the cable management is much tighter here, but with the assistance of this cutout, you'll see in a second there, it was at least reasonable. Or, if you really need 3.5-inch drive storage and really want this case, you can scrap the 2 plastic 2.5-inch drive panels and install up to 4 3.5-inch drive brackets that take their place. They come in sets of 2, so 2 sets of those brackets means you can get up to 4 3.5-inch drives and 2 2.5-inch drives in this case, which is pretty solid, but of course that will have a massive impact on radiator compatibility, which will drop to none to the front and side, and it's an extra cost. The graphics card install options are good. By default you've got a horizontal configuration, but with some tinkering you can rearrange it into a vertical configuration. However, an option is only as good as being able to use that option, as in you'll need to buy a Phanteks riser cable if you want to go vertical. Something this variable design has sacrificed in general is the ease of use. The removable panels needed some reinforcement to prevent them from being easily bendable, so they have these ridges. These ridges are enough to get past when removing a screw, but once the card is installed and it comes to replacing the screws, more precision is needed, and those ridges cause problems. I needed to downsize my screwdriver to get a better angle and the right force to overcome the tolerance of the card's position relative to the holes. You typically see cases provide cutouts to make this step easier, not ridges that get in the way and make it harder. If they could have made those ridges internal, I think that would have improved the situation overall. It's easier to move that, really. A few words on cable management. I think it's quite strong in this case. There are a lot of cable management specific features like the space behind the power supply unit to store the bulk of your excess cables from the power supply unit. There are also these steel straps to help clamp down the cable bulge from pressing against the side panel, which lead into a strap to the bottom. I didn't find the steel straps particularly useful in my build, but I think they're a nice addition, unlike the chunky plastic guides in the NZXT H210i. There are all the usual holes you'd expect in the main compartment, and the 3D cutout by the power supply unit to drop the cables in really helps with dropping those cables in, the CPU one in particular. Overall, I'd say it's pretty solid, but there is a limitation on the additional components you could add, like a fan controller. With the grid I use for testing, I can only install a couple of 2.5-inch drives in the main compartment, but that's just me. Your mileage may vary. And on that note, actually, I can't even install 2.5-inch drives because I moved the fans to the side, so that could be an issue for you. In the parts box, you get the vertical graphics card bracket that you'll need to purchase the PCI Express riser on top of to actually use. You also get a bunch of zip ties and all the screws you need for the build. If you have any queries about the I/O or RGB connections, the manual does a good job of explaining what you need, and does a good job in general of showing you how to use everything and how it all works. I could go through it all, but it's all there and available online if you really need it, and it's not core to this review. The lighting as standard works really nicely, and the built-in options for modes and colors offer a good deal of flexibility. Speaking of core to the review, how about the performance? Before we get into the results, let's clarify what's being tested. The CPU providing the 60 to 100 watts of heat is a 6700K being cooled by a Scythe Mugen 5 that has its fan fixed to 70% speed, which was predetermined by its acoustic output. That didn't sound very clear. The graphics card providing the heat for us today is the EVGA GTX 1060 Superclocked, which I don't have in the case because I swapped it out for spreadsheet development reasons, but I did test with it, I promise. And that's had its fan fixed to 30% speed based on its acoustic output. It's a very loud single fan. Very small cooler, loud fan. We've got a few configurations and tests to run through. The first is the stock configuration. Two 120mm fans in the front in this case. Then we have a number of optimized configurations. There's a total of 3 to run through to see if we can get any improvements in performance. The first is adding one base intake fan. This is one of the test fans, being a Noctua NF F12 Chromax. The second optimized configuration is adding 2 fans to the side intakes with the stock intakes to the front. And the last optimized configuration is just moving the stock front intake fans to the side as intakes. We'll test all of these configurations at full fan speed and an acoustically limited 37.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the front of the case, and use 2 tests, Priority 5 with Firmark and Firestrike. Then we'll take the best of the best forward to compare with other cases. At full fan speed, the stock and 2 side intake fans provided the best performance overall, technically. The stock front fans did pretty much just as well though, which is really nice to see. It's clearly shipped in a well-optimized configuration. Also, the quietest configuration at 38 decibels, which is a good deal lower than the 40 or so decibels most of the other configurations offered. Stock fans to the side, no good. 10 degrees hotter in my testing, so stick to the front if you can. Acoustically optimized, same, only different. The extra side intake fans opened up an overall 2-degree gap from the stock 2 front fans, and the stock side intake configuration didn't do as bad as the full speed testing relative to the rest of the configurations. I would have liked to have known what an extra rear exhaust would have done, but the install was just too tight to get one in post-build. So how do the results compare to the other cases? Well, it turns out very well indeed. The stock full speed test results were much better than the testing from the O11 Dynamic Mini. Not surprising since it doesn't come with fans as standard, but is still a touch better than the H210i, and the optimized layout is somewhere between the O11 Dynamic Mini with fans and the H210i. Great on the CPU temps, not so good on the GPU temps, but not bad by any means. Overall, relative to the test bench performance, the P200A gets a 9 out of 10, really good. So by my reckoning, this case gets a 7.1 out of 10. I know, there are a lot of sites and channels that do the whole decimal place thing without much reason, but trust me, there's method to the madness. I'll go into this in an upcoming video explaining the whole thing, but long story short, the final score is an average score of 4 factors. The specification score, how much stuff the case can fit in relative to its size and the rest of the market. I've got main specs down for about 220 cases at the moment. Bonus points are awarded on top for the amount, size and general quality of the included fans. Second factor is the thermal performance, which is relative to the lowest temps from the open air test bench and the highest temps the measured components can reach. The build quality is next, which is predetermined by a table breaking down the main elements of a case and what I believe constitutes average, poor, excellent, and so on. And finally, the installation ease. I think this is a key factor. If it's a nightmare to build in, I'd consider not recommending it. That's also predetermined by a table I've created. Only each case starts with 10 and points are taken away based on minor, intermediate and major issues in each key area. So there we go, 7.1. The best case so far is the O11 Dynamic Mini at 7.8, which did get a bonus point for the extra pile of rear panels it comes with. I can award 1 or take away 1 bonus point depending on something that's significantly good or bad that isn't picked up on the other scores. And the worst case is the H210i at 7, so relatively it's not looking great, but it's a solid score nonetheless. But AV, you exclaim, you haven't taken into account the price. The P200A is nearly half the price of all the other cases, including the ARGB fans. And to those of you who are thinking that, you're not just right, you've hit the nail on the head. $120 will get you everything on the board, including the P200A, with a lot of change. Cross this with the score and you've got yourself a heck of a deal. Even if the other cases were 10s, they're too expensive, all things considered, to outshine the P200A D-RGB on price versus score. It's also worth reflecting on the drive situation. There are drive upgrade options available to increase storage at the cost of radiator compatibility and your pocket. That might make this case even more compatible for you than it was, and still cheaper than the other options like the H210i. Final thoughts, great thermal and acoustic performance out of the box, plenty of cooling options, not amazing drive compatibility out of the box, but room in the reasonable price to add those extra drive cages, and a good looker with ARGB fans to boot. Certainly gets my recommendation. If you enjoyed this one, please make sure you hit the like button. I've been out of the game for a while, but I think I've come back on somewhat decent form. Let me know what you think of the new scoring system so far. I'm yet to release a video on how it all works, but I've done my best to make it as objective as possible to rate all cases from the same set of rules. Anyway, that's enough from me. Patreon scrolling by. Look out for a video on Patreon shortly with all sorts of thoughts from this video and previously. It's been a long time since I've been here, so thanks for the support, and I'll catch you in the next one.